You must wonder if we're actually going to get to the program. We got 3 or 4 more people to introduce. No, thanks, Christine, and thanks, Mona. Obviously, this is a special event, different kind of structure to it. We're going to have a discussion, and if they start saying bad things or they get off track, I'll bring them back into the middle. But otherwise, I'm going to mostly let them go. It's also a special day for me because I've learned a new word, which is, how do you pronounce it again? Sesquicentennial. I think it's wonderful. You know, when you get older, you think, well, you know all the words you need. Then you get a new one. So that's exciting. It means 150 years, and I guess it's the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, and a 50th anniversary of the publication of the book by Robert Penn Warren, The Legacy of the Civil War, which we're going to be talking about today. And we have 2, as usual, wonderful Vanderbilt faculty members to engage in this discussion. First, Michael Kreyling, who is our Gertrude Conaway Professor of English at Vanderbilt. He's an expert in Southern literature and memory and history of the South, and works also on photography and the meaning of authorship in modern American literature. He's written lots of books, including Understanding Eudora Welty and Inventing Southern Literature. And he's joined by a historian, Richard Blackett, our Andrew Jackson Professor of History, who has done a lot of work on the history of the abolitionist movement in the US, and especially its transatlantic connections and the roles that African Americans have played in the movement to abolish slavery. Now, Richard is actually making a return visit here because some of you regulars will recognize him from his previous talk. He is the author of Building an Anti-Slavery Wall, Black Americans in the Atlantic Abolitionist Movement, his first book, and more recently, Divided Hearts, Britain and the American Civil War. And he's still working on escape routes and ways in which slaves managed to avoid the implications of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850. These 2 wonderful speakers are going to discuss, I guess, the legacy of the Civil War, and ask questions like, and you'll see these laid out in the invitation you had to come, questions like, what has changed in the last 50 years? What do we know about Robert Penn Warren, his personality, his stature, as a writer and critic of American culture? What was the war about? Was it about slavery or about states' rights? In these hard economic times, what's the point of remembering the war? Aren't there more important things to think about? Does the war belong differently to different people? Yankees and Rebels, men and women, African Americans and whites. Why do some people think of it and refer to it as the defining experience of American identity? And back to that word again, how can we best commemorate the war on its sesquicentennial? I'm going to hand this over now to Michael and Richard, and I think Michael's going to sort of start us off.
You hear me if I talk? You hear me? I thought I would begin by just delivering a kind of quick timeline or outline of Robert Penn Warren's life, focusing on the intention of getting him up in March of 1861. Warren was one of those Americans, one of those Southerners, for whom the Civil War was the defining experience of Americanness. He says in the Legacy, if you've all read it, that the Revolution was too simple, that it created a nation on paper, but that it didn't create a nation in blood. That's a typical sort of Warren thing to say. But here, I think if we do a quick outline of his life, you can see sort of what he meant by that. He was born in 1905 in Guthrie, Kentucky, just up the road, right across the state line. He went to high school in Clarksville. He enrolled in 1921, not quite 17 years old, at Vanderbilt, and graduated in 1925, summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, with a Founder's Medal. That's a hat trick. You can't do. There aren't a lot more prizes to win. He was 20 years old when he graduated from college. There's something of a what's the word, phenom about him. He immediately went to graduate school at UCLA, where he got an MA. By 1927, he was at Yale. He's making the rounds of quality educational institutions. In 1928, he was at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. It is there in Oxford that he began to engage the South and the Civil War in a professional way. He wrote, or began to write, his first book, John Brown, The Making of a Martyr. His first entry then, or his first published engagement with the Civil War, is through John Brown. Now, for Warren, Brown was not a saintly hero, but something of a psychopath, a misfit, a failure, who was made a martyr by political and cultural interests who wanted to advance his cause. Also, while he was in Oxford in late 1920s, he wrote his essay for I'll Take My Stand, The Briar Patch, which is the only essay in that famous collection that directly and thoroughly addresses the question of race in the South. His take on race was basically to affirm Booker T. Washington's approach of accommodation and gradualism in integration. This would be 1931 when I'll Take My Stand was published. So early on, Warren is already addressing the Civil War and what is basically one of the main causes of the Civil War, and that is race. Between 1934 and 1941, he was at LSU, teaching, editing the Southern Review. When Huey Long shut down the Southern Review in the early 1940s, Warren moved north to Minnesota, and he was on the faculty at the University of Minnesota from 1942 to 1950. In 1946, as we all know, he published his most famous novel, All the King's Men, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize. And then in 1950, he started his long association with Yale. He had tried to get into Yale as a graduate student when he was at UCLA, but he couldn't transfer, but he finally made it in the other way as a faculty member. Actually, a faculty member at the Yale School of Drama. He was a professor of playwriting there and retired in 1973. So he was at Yale for about 22 years. Now, he was at Yale through the 1950s, a fairly, I guess we could say, important decade in American race relations. This is when the civil rights movement becomes more public, becomes more activist or proactive. And beginning in the 1950s, Warren goes back to these obsessions that he has about Southern and American identity. In 1956, he publishes a little book called Segregation, the Inner Conflict of the South. In 1961, then asked by the editors of Life magazine to assess the importance of the Civil War at its centennial, he writes The Legacy of the Civil War. At the same time, he's working on the only novel that he wrote that directly addresses the Civil War, a novel called Wilderness, which came out in the same year, 1961. It was a critical failure. It didn't really work with readers or reviewers. But he tried to digest the Civil War both in fiction and nonfiction in 1961. And that was an important, I think, year, more important than 2011 in terms of public interest in the war, because in the same year, in Look magazine, the major sort of coffee table competitor to Life, McKinley Cantor had published a short novel called If the South Had Won the Civil War. So both major sort of monthly magazines were devoting resources to remembering the Civil War. Life magazine has Warren assessing its importance, and Look magazine has a more popular sort of counterfactual novel by McKinley Cantor called, If the South Had Won the Civil War. If you ever get a chance to read a copy of that, it's a kind of an interesting sort of book, if you like counterfactuals in that sense. The 60s then became a really important decade for Warren in all respects, because a couple of years later, in 1964, he started work on Who Speaks for the Negro. Again, this was a book that part of which was commissioned by Life magazine, who paid him to travel around the South and interview African American leaders to find out, since the civil rights movement was getting more and more public, more and more activist, more and more on people's minds, he wanted to go and find out just who was leading it and what the major ideas were. That book, Who Speaks for the Negro, came out in 1965. About in that same decade when, say, William Starr was writing The Confessions of Nat Turner, and a lot of other authors are white authors especially, were trying to get a hold of what was going on in racial politics in the United States. When Warren wrote The Legacy of the Civil War, I think I can end with this just for the moment. There was a lot of concern by white Southern liberals about who was going to control the memory of the Civil War at the Centennial. Willie Morris, who was an editor of Harper's at the time, William Styron, who was a young novelist at the time, C. Van Woodward, who was Warren's colleague on the history department at Yale, were concerned that the memory of the Civil War and the definition of the South would be taken over by, in a sense, the wrong Southerners. I'll read you just a paragraph from, you probably know who these wrong Southerners are going to be. They're going to be mostly Southern governors, Orville Faubus being the big bad wolf of that group, but James Lindsay Allman of Virginia is another one, who were segregationist governors, and Warren and these liberal Southerners were afraid that they would hijack the memory of the Civil War and take it into a kind of segregationist and massive resistance politics. And what he was trying to do was to re-remember the Civil War in a way that would get it out of their grasp and bring it into a more American rather than regional Southern context. So part of one of the subtext of The Legacy of the Civil War is to try to make it American rather than Southern, more national rather than regional or partisan. I'll just read you this paragraph and then let Richard talk for a while. Does he, the Southerner, ever realize that the events of Tuscaloosa, Little Rock, and New Orleans, now the readers who are picking up The Legacy of the Civil War are looking at Life magazine in 1961, know what Tuscaloosa and Little Rock and New Orleans means. These are demonstrations, mostly white riots against school integration. You can probably see in the newsreel footage of some still photographs of white parents yelling at black students going into schools. And what Warren is worried about is that
that South is going to hijack the memory of the Civil War, and that the Civil War meant that. Does he ever realize that the events of Tuscaloosa, Little Rock, and New Orleans are nothing more than an obscene parody of the meaning of his history? His language is pretty strong. It is a debasement of his history, with all that was noble, courageous, and justifying bleached out, drained away. Does the man who, in the relative safety of mob anonymity, stands howling vituperation at a little Negro girl being conducted into a school building, feel himself at one with those gaunt, barefoot, whiskery scarecrows who fought it out breast to the death at the Bloody Angle at Spotsylvania in May 1864? Can the man howling in the mob imagine General Robert E. Lee, Confederate States of America, shaking hands with Orville Faubus, governor of Arkansas? So for Warren, remembering the Civil War meant taking the control of it out of the hands of a Southern political and cultural group that he thought was going to debase it. It was basically a political or a cultural political move on his part. And so this book, in a lot of ways, mostly in its subtextual ways, but in a lot of its overt ways, you can see it trying to grab the South away from a specific Southern audience. And one of the things that's important to think about in the sesquicentennial year is, do we have the same ingredients or the same elements of a political or cultural contest going on? Does anybody, in other words, care enough to try to possess this memory in a certain sort of way? And I'll just stop there for time.
I think we can all go home now. The last time I was here, I got myself in deep trouble because I said some things that were pretty negative about Montgomery Bell. And I heard from graduates of the academy that I was being terribly unfair. But then we all kissed and made up. I think, let me pick up a little bit on what Michael has said. By coming at the 100th anniversary through a brief discussion about the 150th anniversary. I'm not going to say that, try to say that word. There are too many syllables in it. To try and get at where we are in 2011. And if you recall, there are a number of things that have occurred that have raised the temperature of the debate. And the temperature is always raised over issues of race. Because in spite of what we say, in spite of what many of us would like to say, race is at the center of this whole discussion about the Civil War. Whether it is the cause of the war or whether people say it has nothing to do with the war. On either side, race comes up. We have that wonderful effort by the governor of Virginia to declare April Confederate Day month, and wish to argue that slavery had nothing in fact, he didn't argue that. He didn't even mention the S word. Slavery, he got himself in deep trouble, and then he backpedaled at an amazing speed. But I don't know if he may have been mollified by the reaction to it, but I don't know if it changed many minds. The second event has to do with the present governor of Mississippi, who announced not too long ago that the 1950s in his tongue wasn't all that bad. As he recalled. Somebody reminded him of a few events, and he too has backpedaled. The third event that I want to point to is that fourth grade book that was published, history book that was published in Virginia. It declared that thousands, scores of African Americans fought for the Confederacy. Now, you have to have been imbibing something that is terribly illegal to come up with that kind of a conclusion. There's absolutely no evidence that this occurred. in order to reinforce the argument that it did, and it's, I want you to imagine a PowerPoint up here. I don't use PowerPoint, but it may have helped in this case. But an illustration is used showing blacks, African Americans in gray uniforms. And the conclusion was that here's the evidence that they fought for the Confederacy. What you don't see is that the photograph, the illustration is cropped. And you see, if you look very closely, you would see one arm next to the group of African Americans lined up in uniforms. You would see an arm, and you would notice, if you are very careful, that you notice that the arm is covered in a sleeve that is blue. And if you find the original of this illustration, you would find that the officer standing next to these African Americans who are ostensibly fighting for the Confederacy is a Union officer. Now, this may be the ultimate kind of reconciliation, but I don't think this is what is driving this discussion. What they don't tell you is that these African Americans in this illustration were not Virginians. What they were members of what we call the African Corps, or the Native Guards of Louisiana, who themselves, at the beginning of the war, before uniforms were decided, were an armed militia, and who therefore dressed themselves in the way that they thought they should dress themselves. It has nothing to do with whether or not African Americans fought for the Confederacy. So we see, even in 2011, that the dispute continues, and efforts are being made to bend history to the political needs and whims of certain individuals. The difference between 1961 and 2011 is there is enough work has been done, and enough work is being done to make sure that this sort of interpretation of the war no longer can stand the test or can stand scrutiny. So we are in a different sort of place. But in 1961, when Robert Penn Warren is writing this book, as Michael said, he is attempting to make this an American story rather than a Southern or a Northern story or a Yankee story. And therefore, he takes a position that is critical to both sides, to the purists on both sides. And he has two wonderful phrases. He calls it the great alibi, and that is how he describes the Southern interpretation of the war. And that is that everything that is discussed about the war in which slavery is involved, there's an explanation and an excuse for it. And on the other side, he calls it the treasury of virtue, that the Yankees are very pure and very compassionate, and they're very committed to racial equality, and everything, and because they won, it follows logically that the good guys were the victors. And I think it is his attempt to make this an American story. And as a consequence, I think the story that he tells tends to leave you wanting more, tends to leave the person who knows more about this war and its occurrences feeling that you hadn't been adequately served. And I think this is one of, if there's a failure of the book, it is a wonderful read. It's the kind of thing that if you get on a plane, you can read it before the plane lands. It doesn't matter if you're going to Chattanooga or wherever it is. Does anybody fly to Chattanooga either? I've gotten in trouble now with the people from Chattanooga. But it is that kind of book that is a wonderful read. And for those of you who haven't, you can go and buy it on Amazon.com, and you will have it in a few days. But it is, I think I would like to stop there on this general idea of where we have traveled since 1961 in the last 50 years. In 1961, we can talk a little bit, if it comes up, about the organization of the Centennial, who organized it, who determined what we celebrated, and that will, I think, would provide some interesting insights into what was happening in 1961. And I'm sure the majority of people in this room were in their infancy in 1961. You want to?
No, I'm not going to jump.
You're not going to follow up on this? Let me just say, in the attempt to celebrate the centennial in 1960, there was a great reluctance because in 1961 we are in the midst of the Cold War. So the concern is not just who would have control of this, but whether or not if we make this an American story, it makes America look good in the eyes of the world. Because it's only 2 years after Sputnik. You know, I grew up in Trinidad, and I still remember as a kid, people say one night it got cold, and people said, oh, it's because of Sputnik. And when I say cold, it got down to like 75 degrees. So this is a concern. This is 2 years after the Russians seem to have gotten ahead, and there's a deep concern that America is on the defensive. And this is its Achilles heel. The Civil War is its Achilles heel, and therefore it has to be presented in such a way that makes America look good. So that the efforts to organize the Centennial, so you have that on one hand, and then you have people in the former Confederate states who were not anxious to join this national effort because they thought it was in the hands of Northerners, of Yankees, and they would not be balanced in their interpretation of the war. And the way the issue is resolved to some extent is that control of the Centennial is placed in the hands of local organizations. So Tennessee is finally pushed, for instance, to join the effort. And then one of the ways that they join the effort is on the understanding that they would give a lot of authority to local communities to organize their own celebrations. So that what you see happening is that people in Chattanooga who want to do their own celebration would bring their own interpretation to the war. All you have to do is go around, even walking around Nashville, and I am, and you'd hear from my accent that I'm not from Nashville, but walking around Nashville, I read many historical markers. Many of them were put up in this period in 1960, that period between 59, 60, and 65. And the issue and the interpretation of those, in many of those historical markers, from this vantage point, leaves something to be desired. But they reflected not only where people were at the time they were put up, but also how they thought about the events. Because the power to determine what was put on those markers is to a large extent driven by the consideration of the people who are organizing it, and those considerations are driven in turn by the needs to put their own interpretation on the events from a local perspective. So you have a diffusion, and it is one of those ways that made it possible then for the centennial celebration to have some measure of success. You have a national organization, you have a state organization, and you have many scores of local organizations. And what drives the interpretation and the commemoration of the war is what happens on that local level. And I think, therefore, one of the things that we see, and some people may have some views on what happened back in the early 60s in Tennessee and in their local communities, but I think that's what drives it. So, to some extent, Penn Warren is fighting against this trend. The national organization was first headed up by a man with the last name of Grant. And he had initials after, he had numbers after his name, the third, which in a democracy is wonderful. You have these kind of aristocratic things. Ulysses S. Grant III. I'm just Richard Blackett the first.
And last.
Or the last, yes. After today, you mean? But that there was incredible resistance to the fact that Grant's descendant was actually going to head up this thing, this organization. And there was a sort of coup, and Grant was thrown out, and they put a couple academics, and you know we can be very wishy-washy, and we bend with the wind and things like that, and they became the leadership then of the national organization. But at the state level, that is completely different. There's a man of considerable, who had an excellent publication record, a man called Stanley Horn, that ran the Tennessee State Centennial. I have an article published in the most recent issue of the Tennessee Historical Quarterly, but right after me is an article by Horn, a republished article from an earlier issue, and I feel as though he is reaching up and just putting me in my place. But Horn ran the show from where he stood, and his interpretation of the war is fundamentally different from Warren's. So it mattered locally what was happening is the moral of my story.
And one of the morals of mine is that Richard brought this up too, it also mattered globally. Because in 1961 there was the evil empire out there, and we were in, you know, the crucial stages of the Cold War. McKinley Cantor's counterfactual, if the South had won the Civil War, is resolved in the end by the South and the North and Texas, which secedes from the South, and all getting together to fight the commies. So what consolidates and brings us back to union is, again, the Civil War. So what do we have now in 2011? Do we have an evil empire out there, or some sort of external enemy which can help us to sort of sand down the edges of internal differences? I tend to think no. But you know, in other words, there's a sort of historical context that's important to keep in mind when we deal with the Centennial. And the question to ask ourselves is, what corresponding historical context, if any, do we have now that might shape this remembrance? I tend to think not.
But let me add another conspiratorial element.
Okay.
If you notice, there's not a great deal there's not a hive of activity over the 150th anniversary. They're not organizations and governments and local communities throwing money at doing this. There's a kind of quiet about it, and it's a quiet that is explained, or if not excused, by the fact that these are hard economic times. And therefore, money would be better spent than to having people celebrating the 150th anniversary. Let me suggest a slightly more conspiratorial interpretation. Unlike 1961, this time around, African Americans would have had to play a critical and central role to the interpretation of the Civil War. We have had 50 years of extensive research and a reinterpretation of American history in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement. To some extent, the 150th anniversary celebration, at its core, at its center, would have been the role of African Americans in the war. And I think for some, this is not what they want to do. So in a way, like Warren and others faced in 1961, the politics of the time engenders a certain reluctance to do what we should be doing in the way we should be doing it. So that's my additional conspiratorial piece. And I'm sure people would have something to say about that. You want to throw it over, David?
Well, I think there's a generational divide. I had the experience of trying to explain segregation to some sixth graders a couple of years ago. And after that dawned on them that I wasn't just telling a story, they looked at me and said, "You're kidding." I said, "Yeah, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard in my life." And in the textbook, when you come to the Civil War,
I think
Harriet
you have modern technology next to you there.
Tubman-
The kids would be unfazed.
Okay, you want me to begin again?
No, I'm sure.
Okay, anyhow, and also in the textbooks, Harriet Tubman is one of the heroes that's in the textbooks about the Civil War. It's an entirely different story. I think we're all pretty much of a generation here today, but for kids, the things you're talking about and the things that Warren thought were so important and all of that, it might as well be something to do with the Byzantine Empire as far as they're concerned.
Right,
Because their life experience is so divorced from that. My granddaughters and all, this one here too. The idea that people are actually taking all that seriously is just to them is inconceivable.
but your granddaughter's comments are the best thing I've heard about the Civil War. But let me just say, what I opened with, the fact that today, recently, you would have a 4th grade history book in Virginia, which attempts to bend history in such a way and to distort it. You have to ask the question, what is going on? And the fact that people still believe, I suppose I won't get into that, but people still believe that there were hundreds of African Americans who fought for the Confederacy, whatever it is you tell them. Gets into the realm of religion. People believe it. And there's very little that you can do to disabuse them of that notion. And you try desperately, and it doesn't always work. But what I found really troubling is the fact that in a 4th grade history book, you could attempt to do, and this is a 4th grade history book, because textbooks are written to cater to local communities, that there's somebody who would publish a textbook that would contain that kind of distortion. And somebody just wouldn't run them out on a rail as they used to do in the old days.
But isn't that what happened? Your cup's half full, mine's half empty, mine's half full. I look at the pushback.
That's fine.
That to me is what's important, that they might try it, but where before that would have gone,
Yes.
look at the textbooks that there were there.
Yes.
Now, you can't do that because you just get slapped in the face when you try it.
I think there's one back there, way back.
I wonder if some of the problem is that in our country we kind of ignore some of the problems, and slavery still exists in America, and there are millions of slaves existing in this country today. And if that can happen, why not change the past as well?
Well, I don't know if I would say slavery still exists. I think oppression still exists, but these things are different. Slavery still existing in certain parts of the world, and there are ways that labor is exploited, but I don't think we need to conflate the two things. We need to separate these things. The better to explain it. I think there's one over here for
I'd like to make the case that there isn't any history.
that there isn't.
Apropos of what you're saying, that the only history that matters is the history that we think we know. It's what people have chosen. I know you said you worked in the area of history and memory, and the memory is a lot more important than the history. What people think they know, what they have chosen to embed in their culture, that's the history that matters.
No, it doesn't.
Let me rephrase that. That's the history that's relevant. What is still governing people's lives?
If people's lives are still governed by fiction, then that's irrelevant. Because that can get really dangerous. If people, as Richard was saying, if people think or believe, not think, believe, that, say, slavery was actually a humane and on the whole kind and familial kind of institution, then they've got it wrong. And then they're part of what Warren called here, you know, the great alibi, and they're living in La La Land. And what he says here, I mean, he's very clear about this too, is that people who live in La La Land, people who don't have an accurate view of what happened, history with a small h, then they will be, and it's a cliche, then they'll do it over again. They'll make the same mistakes again. And he could see that coming in the fight against integration. He saw it coming, and that's why he was so adamant about controlling or trying to control not the memory of the Civil War, but the history of it, trying to get people to agree on the history. He admits in the legacy of the Civil War, he does it very early on, he says it was about slavery. He says it was about slavery. He says it about 3 times.
Follow up for just a second. I didn't mean that I thought that made it true. What I meant was, as a professional academic historian, what interests me is why and how people chose a particular version of it.
Well, that's different.
Yeah, I buy, which makes it contested, right?
Yeah.
And that's why we have to be vigilant about the people who would put out the sort of illustrations that they did in the fourth grade history. And to go back to the original question, that's why the pushback gives you hope that there are people out there who would say, look, you can't do this, this is wrong. Which to some extent, the voices of resistance to that sort of thing, I think, and this is the hopeful bit, is much stronger in 2011 than they were in 1961.
We've just had, you can go on YouTube and find an example of this. You just type in Michelle Bachmann and Anderson Cooper. I mean, Representative Bachmann is saying, her version of history is that the Founding Fathers struggled night and day to end slavery. They did not.
Well, not at night, though.
No, not at night, okay. And it makes a difference, because there you clearly have an example where a selective, massaged history is turned into the basis of a political agenda. And what Richard says is when that happens, you just have to say no. No, that's not true. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you believe it or not. It's not true. And so that's where you separate memory and history. I mean, there are communities of memory, families, tribes, neighborhoods, who need their memories in order to maintain solidarity and continuity. But there are also national groups, and this is one of the points that Warren makes in the legacy, who need history. They need to know exactly, or as close as possible, what happened, so they know what they have become, because there are great consequences. He talks about, one of the most moving pages or so in here is where he describes how many Americans died in the Civil War and the means by which they died. Limbs blown off, bleeding to death he said, people really died, and they really died because of these beliefs. And so it's important to get them right, because lives are at stake. Okay.
Thank you so much. This is most interesting. A demographic point to be made would be that in 1961, there were still people alive whose fathers or uncles or cousins actually fought in that conflict.
Warren makes that exact point, and I'm glad you brought that up too, because I think I saw somewhere that the last legitimate Confederate veteran had died in 1959. And Warren makes the point here that he personally knows someone who fought in the Civil War, and he knows people who knew people who fought in the Civil War, so that memory of it is still physical. Whereas in 2011, if there's anybody still alive who fought in the Civil War.
Well, actually, I was in Franklin, and they had a Confederate son and a Union son of actual veterans but these gentlemen fathered these children when they were in their 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
My next point would be that,
This, oh, well.
and the two gentlemen were in their like 80s and 90s. I was so
that's
glad I
very
was
good.
there. Anyway, I know quite a few reenactors and Civil War buffs, and there is a defensiveness amongst white Southern Civil War buffs who, you'll see the bumper stickers and stuff, they say it's heritage,
Means not hate.
hate. And that's part of that race issue which still haunts us and is a part of the deal. And if y'all could address that 150 years later, that would be nice. Thank you so much for letting me comment.
Heritage. It's one of those words that you can't get upset about. It's a very neutral word, and it's a very warm and fuzzy word. And it's the kind of word you could embrace, wrap your arms around. But look, if you start talking about heritage, and you start talking about the South, there's a word that I never use, the South, when talking about the Civil War or talking about the period before the Civil War, because when the word is used, it usually excludes a significant portion of the population. When people talk about the South, they're not talking about black people in that period. They're talking about whites. So when folks use the word South as heritage, that heritage does not include slavery, or that heritage does not include the benefits that people derive from being white in a slave society. That heritage doesn't explain why the majority of population, although they are not economically vested in a system, would fight for that system. It is no wonder that there weren't hundreds of black people fighting for the Confederacy. It's no coincidence that the Confederacy couldn't bring itself to talk about enrolling African Americans in their military until the week before Appomattox and Lee's surrender, in spite of the fact that some people in leadership in the Confederacy were saying, guys, look, there's this whole population over here that we should use if we need to survive. But people could not bring themselves to do it. So heritage is freighted with all kinds of significance. And it's not a word that I want to excise. But it is a word that has that I don't buy. I don't go around posing heritage and hate together. It's a defensive position that I understand, but historically it doesn't stand up.
There's one here.
Well, one concern I have about this whole Civil War sesquicentennial, I can say the word.
You said it.
Is that because we live in two armed camps now when it comes to the information that we have. We're in gated communities. We either watch Fox News and Lindbergh, who has his own American history course. Yes, history according to Beck. And then you have the MSNBC crowd, and the concern is that there's not certain pieces of history don't have the same weight. When you have the Texas School Board that is trying to, in their curriculum now, say that Jefferson Davis's inaugural address, though importantly it may be to understand the context in why the South seceded, is not as important as Lincoln's inaugural address. No more than the Catholic Church's position on astronomy is valid in a science classroom from the 1600s. That's not as that weight of that knowledge is not as important as the weight of Galileo's knowledge of astronomy. So my concern is that people in this whole sesquicentennial celebration that we're going to have are going to start trying to place certain weight on pieces of history. Important as they are, they're not as important as other pieces of history. That's my comment.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely correct. But to go back to the original question, if there is hope, there is a hope. It is that in 2011, and I'm impressed that you said the word twice in one comment. In 2011, there are enough people who have a working knowledge of what happened. And although they are still what you call two-gated communities, it's a wonderful image. There are people who are willing and who are able to counter some of the silliness. Michael brought up Michelle Bachmann. He shouldn't have done that. We could be here all day. She said, I mean, her most recent one is that all immigrants who came to this wonderful country came to this wonderful country on the same terms. Now, I know it snows a lot in Minnesota, so it may have something to do with that. But this is silly, and you have immediate responses to it. So yes, there's contestation and there are differences and all that sort of stuff. But that, I think, we are in a place that is different. I wouldn't say better, but we are in a place that is different than 1961.
One thing I should add too, just to tag on to your, Warren in here may be one of the last people who believes that there is an Americanness that came out of the Civil War. Regardless of the differences between the two sides, he believed, and there were pluses and minuses, pros and cons to this Americanness that came out of the Civil War, but he believed there was a singular unified American identity that came out of that war. It wasn't a simple one, and there were things about it he didn't like, but there was an Americanness he could appeal to, and he could say, there's the identity. That's what the Civil War did. It finally got out into the open, these gated differences, and bloody as it was, it bludgeoned them back into one identity. And he was willing to live in a pragmatic sense. He uses pragmatism a lot as a term in here. He's willing to live with that mixedness of that identity because it gave Americans some common identity. And what I think you bring up is really relevant. It's like in 2011, have we lost that now?
I'm afraid we're going to have to draw it all to a close. Do you want to just ask your question and we'll see if we can get a quick response?
Very quick statement, seeking any random comments. That my impression is actually that there is some formal observation of the sesquicentennial going on, specifically with government-sponsored balls, cotillions, galas, choose your word, in South Carolina and Virginia specifically. And the significance of the fact that we live in a political era where there is widespread, decentralized, and even violent resistance against the imposition of Washington, D.C.'s will on the states by a president whose position in 1861 in society would have been very, very clear.
Yes, wonderful comment. Let me just say two things. The opening event of the 1961 celebration in Nashville was a secession ball. They ran down the Union Jack from the mast on the state
Stars
capitol
and
put up did I say the Union Jack?
Yes, you did.
That was a bit earlier.
There's a colonial slip for you. But they ran up the whatever that flag is, and then they celebrated with a secession ball, and it was called a secession ball, which is interesting. The one in South Carolina, in Charleston, was this time was called a Confederate ball. But what is interesting is that there were massive demonstrations outside. So there was pushback, and that did not happen in 1961, and I couldn't have imagined it happening in 1961. In fact, people would have stayed as far away. If you were African American living in Nashville, you would stay as far away as possible from a secession ball. So there is pushback. But you're right, though.
One last one.
What is a Tennessee sesquicentennial committee appointed by the governor? There's a lot of programming going on that really has nothing to do with balls and all that stuff. But things like digitization of people's records from the war, both African American experience, Yankee and everything. So I think we need to maybe educate ourselves a little bit more about what's happening in the state of Tennessee in terms of our programming that is funded partially by the governor.
So no, there's funding for what we call historical events, and I take your point very well. But the larger sort of political events that have that is freighted with all sort of political significance is not there. I mean, one of the things that the folks did in the Tennessee Centennial Commission is they didn't digitize, but they collected a lot of documents from different communities coming out of the Civil War, which was very important. But what carried the larger message, political message, were these other events. And that is the point I was trying to make. Those larger, wider political commemorations seem not to be occurring.
We have so many more questions, but which is a mark of just how much you've all enjoyed listening to our two speakers. Which, thank you again. And, I want to thank again Antoinette for suggesting this this program, and come back in 50 years. We're going to have the bicentennial.
Yes.
Easier to say.